Jennifer's origins are Dutch. She was born in Hamilton, Ontario, which, those of us who know Hamilton, is a city which is very busy reinventing itself and doing a very interesting job in the process, a process which involves the maintenance of a great deal of its heritage. Hamilton's had problems with its heritage, which I think those problems are being resolved very well. They're continuing. One of ACO's big struggles with some buildings that were built at the time Hamilton was created in the 1840s, which are still under threat. But heritage is understood to be integral to the present and the future of that city. Jennifer Keesmaat started her studies studying English and philosophy at the University of Western Ontario, and I'm sure that she finds her philosophical training extremely useful in her job. Likewise, the politics that she studied along with planning at the York University, and I'm sure that she wishes she didn't have to deal with so much politics as she tries to go about planning that enormously complicated city of Toronto. Jennifer Keesmaat has experience working on the planning of more than 10 cities in Ontario, plus 3 others outside this country in the United States, Ireland, and Greece. So her experience is enormous. I don't want to steal her thunder, but I'm sure that you will be interested in her feelings with regard to density. We all know that our cities are growing. They're particularly growing on their outskirts, on their fringes, which is a tremendous problem. It's devouring agricultural land. It's devouring recreational land. It now takes me about an hour and a half to get away from my home in downtown Toronto to the nearest hiking country, which if I leave early enough in the morning, I can get there in an hour. Otherwise, it takes me 2 or 3. And I know it can take as long as 2 hours or even longer to reach Hamilton from Toronto. So we have a huge problem in both terms of land being engulfed by new development and the transit problems that is producing. And the answer to that, of course, is to concentrate that density in places where it's appropriate. And that can have tremendous impacts on heritage. And you're going to be learning this morning about Jennifer's interest in the heritage of the past and in the walkable cities that our grandparents enjoyed before the age, or great-grandparents in most cases, before the age of the automobile. But this is far too much for me already. I have great pleasure in introducing to you Jennifer Keesmaat, Chief Planner of the City of Toronto.
Thank you so much, Richard. I am absolutely thrilled to be here today to talk to you about blending centuries, heritage conservation, and urban renewal. From my perspective, heritage is about city building. Heritage is about livability. Heritage is about ensuring that as our cities transform and change over time, that we not only we identify our connections to the past, but we also recognize and give meaning to the present and the future. This is a particular challenge in a city that is growing very quickly, in the city, such as the city of Toronto. And I'm very happy to be sharing with you a whole series of examples of how we are seeking to address some of these challenges in the Toronto context. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of what's happening in Toronto, we processed over 5,000 development applications in 2014. We issued over 6,000 heritage permits for changes to heritage buildings. We have over 204 large development projects underway that involve multiple tall buildings. We have 108 tall buildings that are currently under construction in the city. This is a great and profound change. With this great and profound change comes some risk, you could say. Risk that things are happening so quickly that we're not, in fact, being very careful in ensuring that we're creating a city that will be livable over the very long term. So there's a variety of ways that we think about heritage and integrating heritage conservation into the work that we do. And a critical part of our strategies I would like to unfold by walking you through a series of examples over the course of this morning. I'm going to walk through these examples and then we're going to have some time for Q&A. So if you think of something as I'm going along that doesn't make sense or that you'd like to prod a little bit deeper, by all means just jot down a note, and in the Q&A I'll be happy to explore any of these ideas with you in more detail. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about tall buildings, and often when we're talking about heritage, people don't want to talk about tall buildings. But the reality is, the City of Toronto has more tall buildings than almost any other city in North America as it is today. We have over 1,000 tall buildings in our city, and we will continue to be a city that builds tall buildings. This will continue to be an incredible part of how we live, an incredible part of our built form identity. It also presents a tension and a challenge that we need to manage in our heritage conservation efforts. So figuring out the relationship between tall buildings and the heritage of our city is a critical exercise that we are constantly struggling with. And I'd like to unfold for you some of the ways that we have been struggling with this in the Toronto context. I'll then like to talk a little bit about adaptive reuse. One of the great risks to heritage buildings and heritage infrastructure is that it becomes unused and obsolete. In a fast-growing city, there's a great opportunity to be adapting buildings that have been used in the past for uses that will ensure their meaning, their usability into the future. So I'll walk through a series of adaptive reuse examples. I'll then like to talk about heritage conservation districts, because heritage conservation districts are a critical part of our strategy in the City of Toronto to protect as much heritage infrastructure as possible in really the most straightforward way, given the growth that we see, the significant amount of growth that we see. So I'll tell you a little bit about that strategy. Our strategy is unique. It is well underway. I believe it is successful. We're very excited about it. It's taken many years to kind of lay the groundwork for this strategy to unfold, and we're now right in the heart of delivering on a significant number of heritage conservation districts. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about the future of the past. Our heritage policies overall in the City of Toronto. There is a real tension when a city is growing so quickly, and there is a pressure for redevelopment to create frameworks that allow for and embrace the integration of the heritage assets, the landscapes, the view corridors that we value, and to protect them over the long term. And we know that growing quickly is often the best of times and the worst of times. Some wonderful things happen and some terrible things happen. And as you can appreciate, I'm not going to be talking to you today about the terrible things that have happened, but I wanted to qualify what I'm saying because I don't want you to think that I'm blind to some of the things that are happening in the city that I would like to see happen differently. And the reality is, it is in fact a constant struggle to be bringing to the fore how important it is to recognize and value our built heritage in our city. And one of those tensions is because of the very high land values that come with fast growth that leads to a drive to treat every site as a site that has speculative value. And boy, oh boy, are those old buildings a pain. Aren't those old buildings a real problem with respect to accessing that speculative value? So I'm going to show you some of the examples where we got it right. Some of the examples where, through a tremendous amount of tenacity on the part of community activists, residents groups, city planning staff, and city councilors, we have been able to shape the change that is coming in order to realize a whole series of key goals that I would put under the category of creating a livable, walkable, sustainable city. So I'll walk through a whole series of examples. I'm going to go through some of them relatively quickly because I've got a lot in the context of this presentation. But as I mentioned earlier, I would be absolutely thrilled if you'd like to probe a little bit deeper on any of these projects. I will say as an overarching idea at the outset that we are creating, particularly with our response to tall buildings being integrated into the landscape of our heritage buildings, that we are creating a very unique and distinct treatment and approach to heritage buildings. And it is a challenge, but we have a series of guiding documents, including our tall building guidelines. And you see here an excerpt from our tall building guidelines speaking to, for example, the integration of heritage buildings, as well as the scale of the building and how the scale of the building needs to respond to the heritage infrastructure of the city. It's important for you to know at the outset that our tall building guidelines and our new official plan policies encourage the retention and sensitive integration of whole buildings into our redevelopment sites. Facadism is in fact discouraged. In the instances where facadism has been the solution, it's in part been because it has been a compromise, or it has been the extent of what we can achieve on a given site for a whole variety of different reasons. But our tall building guidelines and our official plan policies make it very clear that facadism is not the desired outcome, and the retention of whole buildings is the desired outcome. That's what we aspire to on every given project. Our goal is to keep the best of the old and to encourage the best of the new, so that we are constantly building new legacies through new investment in the city on every given site. Now, I see this in many instances, it's a challenge of will, but in many instances, it's also a challenge of design. It's a design problem, and I'll talk to you a little bit today about the Mirvish Gehry project. But Frank Gehry, of course, is known as one of the best architects in the world, one of the most creative minds when it comes to heritage. And very early on in that process, when a whole series of warehouse buildings were proposed to be simply wiped clean and the site was being treated like a greenfield site, and we were told, there's no way you can integrate this heritage onto this site, my response was, really? The greatest design mind in the world can't figure this one out? And it's important to remember this. And by the way, not only did Frank Gehry figure it out, but he's very proud. He's very proud of the solution on that site, and he's very proud of the heritage buildings on that site that will be restored and retained. So this notion that part of what we face in a high-growth environment is a design challenge is a really, really important idea, because often we get told that it's a financial problem. But really, is it, or is it a design challenge? So I just want to throw that idea out to you, and I want you to keep that idea in mind as I walk through these examples, because all of these examples are rooted in a very sophisticated design response to the city, and they are all examples that are an outcome of a profound amount of tenacity. The solution wasn't self-evident at the outset. The solution was negotiated. And that doesn't mean it was a compromise, but it means it took a lot of creative thinking to get to the solution. And that's a good thing. Our city building ought to demand our highest efforts in collaboration. It ought to. We should be proud of that. We shouldn't see that as a problem. And in keeping with this notion of being tenacious, even though she's not here, I want to give a shout out to Mary McDonald, my manager of Heritage Preservation Services, who has served the City of Toronto tirelessly with her work in leading the Heritage Preservation Services unit, often with very, very few resources for the amount of work that is required to be undertaken. So let's begin our journey. Let's look at some sites in the City of Toronto. No better place to start than Yonge Street, of course, one of our most important historic and Main Street corridors. And what you see here, this is 5 St. Joseph Street on Yonge Street. This is the buildings there's 7 commercial Victorian storefronts and a 19th century warehouse that are in fact not only being restored, but are also being repaired in a way that is keeping with Yonge Street's Main Street quality and character. And as a result, this proposal involves setting back the tower component, which you see in this slide, not an insignificant development. This is a massive development right in the heart of downtown Toronto. But we have been able to achieve maintaining that Main Street character and the restoration of these eight, when you include the warehouse, 8 critical buildings, 7 Victorian Main Street buildings. What's so important about this is we've done something that to many seems counterintuitive, which is push the height away from the Main Street. But the height was pushed away from the Main Street precisely because it presented an opportunity to protect the character of those Main Street properties and to encourage the further investment and revitalization of other Main Street properties along this corridor, of which there are many. For those who don't know the corridor, it's one of the longest Main Street corridors in Canada, and it in fact has the subway directly below it, so there's a wonderful density along this corridor as well. This also demonstrates that when you get the mix right, that you can create profitable projects where you retain whole buildings, heritage buildings, and you restore them and maintain them in perpetuity. This becomes a very profound legacy for the city. Now, if we move a little farther south on Yonge Street, we see the Canadian Bank of Commerce, which was built in 1905-07, and this building will undergo exterior and interior restoration and become the Yonge Street address for what's being called the Massey Tower condominium. Now, this too is an example of maintaining the built form on the Main Street and pushing the tower into the interior of the site. And I wasn't kidding. I hope you can see the tower in this shot. I wasn't kidding when I said that we have a lot of growth pressure and development pressure. But we have been able, through a tremendous amount of negotiation, to secure heritage benefits as a result of this new growth and change. Not only will the historic bank be retained, the project has also allowed for the transformation and revitalization of a jewel in the City of Toronto, which is Massey Hall. Massey Hall will in fact be protected in perpetuity. There's investment in Massey Hall in perpetuity as a result of the negotiations that took place on the site. And I just want to mention here that this is about partnerships. And in fact, it was at the initiative of city staff working in collaboration with the developer that Massey Hall was identified as a community benefit coming out of this project. And there's also new space that's being added onto Massey Hall as well, an expanded back of house, rehearsal spaces, dressing rooms, and a dedicated loading space to the rear of the building. And all of these uses currently go through the front door. There'll now be a back of house. This is very important for improving the functionality of Massey Hall. All of this is an outcome of a developer coming forward with a project and city staff sitting down and working to negotiate, community groups and community activists coming to the table and negotiating and participating in the way that we can leverage great city building as a result of the new development that we see, and how we can protect and restore through our Section 37 agreements and heritage easements, our heritage resources in the city. And it's also important to know that this project also contributed $1 million to the Massey Hall Capital Campaign. Now, let's move north on Yonge Street and take a look at Postal Station K. Now, Postal Station K, which is just north of Yonge and Eglinton, was built in 1936, and it is in fact an excellent example of a public works building with modern classical features. And it has a very important story. It's a National Historic Site. One of the reasons it's a National Historic Site, because it is the location of what was known as Montgomery's Tavern, which played a pivotal role in the 1837 rebellion of Upper Canada. So you can imagine when a developer came forward and said, I'd like to develop this site, there were some pretty critical heritage objectives to achieve in this redevelopment. And I have to say that we're very proud of this project, which represents a really profound collaboration, I believe, on the part of city staff and the councillor and area residents with the developer, who was very responsive to the requests that we brought forward, including one of the very first requests, which was that Postal Station K would be retained in full, that the building would be completely retained in full. Now, this presented a problem for the developer because he couldn't get his building on the site. He couldn't get his tower on the site. And as a result, city staff encouraged the developer to purchase some properties to the west of the site in order to increase the scale of the development parcel to ensure that the building could be retained in full. And originally, the developer had come forward, and there's a lovely public space in front of Postal Station K, and said, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to move the whole building up right to the edge of the street. We had some debate about that. We wanted the building to remain in situ. We wanted the civic space in front of Postal Station K to not only continue to be a civic space, it's currently quite run down, but in fact to be enhanced as a result of the development. So moving the building forward in order to create a development parcel was not something that was acceptable. And as a result, the developer did in fact go and purchase additional properties and expand the size of the site so that he could in fact integrate a building to the rear of the site. Again, pushed away from the heritage building. A very interesting design treatment intended to ensure that the prominence and significance and identity of the heritage building is in fact maintained, and the public square will become a very important civic space once again. It was before, it hasn't been recently, not as long as I can remember, but it is going to be, again, a very important public space. One of the key objectives from a city planning perspective was to ensure that the civic importance of this site wasn't lost in its redevelopment, and to ensure that there continues to be public usage and public access to the building moving forward over time. So this is a great example of a collaboration, and I can tell you, I want you to remember that word tenacity, because remember, the developer came forward with some very different ideas as to what he wanted to achieve on this site. He had plans moving the building around, and there were some conversations that had to be had. Tenacity was necessary to negotiate creative responses that were in the best interest of the public and the city over the long term. So this is another example of a tall building integration. The next example I'd like to show you is Hotel X, which is on the CNE grounds, and it is being constructed adjacent to the Stanley Barracks. This is a 27-story tower that will offer 11 meeting rooms, screening rooms, ballrooms. It is, of course, a hotel. It will also incorporate retail space, rooftop bars and restaurants, and it includes an extensive landscaping plan. This is a unique site because it's right on the CNE grounds, and it feature preserved heritage barracks, and they will be featured on the west side of the development. Now, this is a really important archaeological site in the city of Toronto, and the opportunity of the redevelopment is allowing us to make visible and celebrate and provide public access to this very important architectural resource. And this is from the new fort, and it will in fact be shown. These are from the foundations from the men's barracks from 1840, and they will be preserved at the entrance of the hotel. Now, as a result of a public art competition, this is conceptual, but the intention is to have a structure over those foundations, some type of public art feature that shows the dimensions of the barracks and allows people to see through a clear glass plane the barracks foundations in situ. So this is a very, very exciting new destination in the context of the City of Toronto, where we've been able, through redevelopment, to secure and enhance and provide access to critical archaeological resources. And this is going to be opening up next year. It's under construction as we speak. Now, the next project I'd like to talk about and not spend too much time on is the Mirvish Gary project. And one of the reasons that I like this story so much is because it demonstrates so profoundly the way that we can change our minds in our city building. Because the proposal that came forward, which really treated a critical row of warehouse buildings on King Street in the city of Toronto like a greenfield site, basically said, wipe the slate clean, we're going to put something new and glamorous on this site. That's pretty tantalizing for the residents of the city of Toronto. Really tantalizing. And it was a very difficult conversation. It was very difficult for us to hold our ground. And we identified in the negotiations heritage as a threshold issue. Sorry, we're not talking about uses. We're not talking to you about building heights. We're not talking to you about number of stories until we resolve the heritage issue. This is not a greenfield site. It cannot be treated as such. That was how our conversations began. One of the reasons why our conversations stalled in our negotiations for a very long period of time was because we identified heritage as a threshold issue, and we were unprepared to talk about any other issues unless we resolved the heritage piece first. Because sometimes we in fact do get drawn into conversations and we start talking about other things, and we forget that that heritage threshold issue needs to be resolved before any other issues really can be negotiated in the context of the planning approvals process. So in this project, it was a massive, very sexy project proposed by Frank Gehry and David Mirvish. It was a very intentional PR campaign. It was one of the first times I've heard of a developer hiring a PR company before they'd even submitted their development application. But we know that happened. And we know that happened in part because we had PR companies calling us up and saying, "We've never done this before. Is it legal? Should we take this project on?" To which I always said no. That was the last thing I needed on my hands. But what's so interesting about this story is that as a result of a tremendous amount of negotiation, we dug our heels in, we identified the heritage buildings as being a threshold issue, we made it very clear we were not going to budge on those issues. As a result of those conversations, we were able, after about a year of a stalemate, to see a fundamentally new proposal come forward. And it's not a compromise, as some people have called it, it was a new proposal. And not only was it a new proposal in terms of the heritage buildings and the Princess of Wales Theatre being protected in perpetuity, which we've now secured through the approvals process, but it was new from the perspective of use. And this was very important as well, because the use and the built form could be linked together. In the earlier proposal, it was proposed that those warehouse buildings would be wiped out. One of the reasons that economic development in the City of Toronto was an important ally in this process with us was because economic development was very concerned about the creative uses, because many of these buildings are filled with architects and designers and startups and one-offs. So economic development became an important ally with us in these conversations. The uses proposed in the first proposal, where all of those buildings were wiped away, was a 6-story mall. Not unlike the Eaton Centre, but it was 6 stories. It was a mall. And we were very concerned, and we saw the connection between the built form and the kinds of uses that we wanted to cultivate and facilitate in this very important cultural corridor along John Street. So protecting the buildings was also about protecting uses that fit with the arts and culture direction of this area of the city. And I'm very happy to say that in renegotiating, we did in fact fundamentally shift the character of the project by protecting the built form. And we did not secure all of the heritage buildings. This was a compromise, but we felt that we came to a place that resulted in a very strong project that protected the character, identity, and the story, the narrative of the streetscape that we wanted to protect in this area of the city. And I tell you that story in part because I want you to have a little bit of a sense of some of the complexity that goes into the decision making that leads to these kinds of outcomes. because they are complex and they do involve, I might be making it sound like we always win, but we don't. They do involve give and take and negotiation on both sides when the community comes forward, when developers come forward as well. So that was a little bit of a walk through some of what's happening with respect to our heritage infrastructure and tall buildings. I'm going to shift gears and show you a few signature projects with respect to adaptive reuse. Because I do believe, maybe I'll be so bold as to say, that some of these projects that we have with respect to adaptive reuse are some of the best adaptive reuse you will see in the world. And I say that not because I'm a world traveler, but I say that because I do believe that we are bringing some of the foremost thinking to our integration of design excellence into the adaptive reuse of buildings in the City of Toronto. So the first project that I want to highlight for you, you're likely familiar with, is the TELUS Centre for the Performing Arts. And this is the transformation as well as expansion of some of Toronto's one of Toronto's most important institutions that blends the old and the new without negatively impacting the character of each. Best in class for heritage, best in class for the new built form as well. And that's our objective in our heritage work. So this was transformed into a very active center. It represents a vibrant and important cultural destination along another important cultural corridor in the city of Toronto. It is really the heart of creative education for the country. And this building includes 77 practice and teaching studios, a library, a music, technology labs, centers for research, a theater, and 2 performance halls that are, again, some of the best in class. It's a very important event venue. It's a place of gathering in the city. I can honestly say that before this building had been restored, I had never been in it. In the past 5 years, I'm in this building all the time. And that is the goal of our adaptive reuse. Our goal is to make our heritage resources buildings that people will engage with, that they will experience, that they will, in fact, enjoy. Now, this is a really great slide because it, if you can see the image there, because it includes some very sophisticated transition between the interior and exterior appreciation of the modern and historic infrastructure. And this is a glass enclosed central atrium that provides an architecturally stimulating, relaxed space where students, faculty, and staff meet informally to exchange ideas. And it is the nexus of how you bring together the old and the new. And we have embraced very strongly in the City of Toronto context that buildings should be of their time. That we don't want to try and make buildings from another era. Buildings should be of their time, using the best understanding of technological advances and materials of our time, and also in respecting buildings of the time in which they were built. And I think that this facility demonstrates quite proudly very significant and important times in architectural history in the City of Toronto, including the present day. The next example that I would like to walk you through is the University of Toronto Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design. This is 1 Spadina Crescent. It's one of the city's most prominent and historic addresses, having been built by the Presbyterian Church as a theological college in 1875. But interestingly, to most Torontonians, it's a site that you drive by because it is in the middle of a traffic circle. It is isolated, and it has in fact been neglected over many years. It's housed many different functions up until the present days, but it really has become kind of an isolated relic. And the opportunity for revitalizing this through the University of Toronto School of Architecture, my hope is that it too will become like the TELUS Centre for the Performing Arts and become a space that we all experience and engage and understand. So the renovation of the building includes 100,000 square feet addition that is going to be in glass, stone, and steel. And it will include collaborative studio spaces, an advanced fabrication lab, a principal hall for major public events, and a public gallery. This site that for most of my lifetime I've only passed on a bike or in a car, I believe is going to become a part of our everyday life. This is the objective of adaptive reuse. It is a profound opportunity to add identity and meaning into how we experience the past in the context of the present city. All elevations and some interiors are going to be restored in the context of this. And the new modern addition has been designed in a very sensitive way to be hidden so that it doesn't in fact impact the view corridor when looking in either direction up Spadina Avenue. And this was a tension in any redevelopment that took place on the site, was recognizing the prominent view corridor with which this building has been in fact sited. Another very important example in the context of adaptive reuse is the National Ballet School of Canada. Now, this is a complex that involves a whole variety of different buildings. It includes 2 heritage buildings, one from 1956 and Havergal Ladies College from 1898 and 2001. It includes a theater, Ivy House, and the theater is approximately 4,000 square feet. It also includes, of course, the National Ballet dance studios. There's 12 dance studios, common areas, an academic building with classrooms, and executive offices that have been put into the 1856 restored house. This is another example of a complex array of uses that have been integrated into existing built form in order to create a dynamic and lively center. And it's not a stretch to say that the adaptive reuse of this site has in fact redefined the presence of the National Ballet on an international scale. The campus itself has become an important branding part of its identity and a wonderful metaphor for the ballet as being very much about the past and very, very much about the future. The building achieved a tremendous amount in terms of reinvigorating the perception of the National Ballet and interest in the ballet in Canada. But let's shift gears and talk a little bit about a very different type of project, which is a hospice, Casey House Hospice. This hospice opens its doors in 1988, and it is currently undergoing a massive expansion. The groundbreaking ceremony is in 2 weeks, and the new facility is expected to open in 2016. This will be a renovated heritage mansion, also on Jarvis Street, like the National Ballet, and it will serve as the new headquarters for the hospice. It includes 58,000 square foot building, just to give you a sense of the magnitude of this mansion. Now, some important things to know about this hospice, and here's a rendering of what the revitalized building will look like. It will double the hospital's 150 patient capacity and allow it to offer a much needed daily health program. This is serving the approximately 20,000 residents in the City of Toronto who are living with HIV, many of whom are in fact aging. This is an award-winning design that really importantly meets the objective of ensuring that the hospice feels more like a home than a hospital. What could be a more beautiful location for a hospice? And what a beautiful metaphor. A home, a wealthy home built many, many years ago that is now, in fact, being adapted for people in their last days. There are all kinds of nooks and crannies that have been integrated into the interior design of this building, and a highlight of the design includes a silver courtyard, which is a narrow interior courtyard that is protected and very private, which gives patients a place to experience the outdoors, but in a very, very private setting, which was a key opportunity and a key objective of the Hospice Committee driving this project forward. So the hospice is going to offer in- and outpatient service, of course the hospice, home care, and outreach services. And it is really focused on serving very vulnerable populations. So it is extremely well located on Jarvis Street. This is a project that I believe will be established as a national best practice once it is complete. Another very interesting project is a CNR locomotive repair shop that is being turned into a Longo's. This is on the commercial side of adaptive reuse, and the next example I'll show you is commercial as well. These tend to be very challenging. Sometimes we have very large buildings, but they can in fact become compelling retail spaces. And this is an example that, this is in Leaside. This was a 1919 CNR locomotive repair shop, and it has been transformed into a modern supermarket. And it's tricky to find the uses for these buildings that are of such a massive scale. And in fact, a supermarket is a great way to adapt and reuse such a site. Another example, which most of you are probably familiar with, this is a very well-known example, of course, in the Canadian context, is the Loblaws and Ryerson University's adaptive reuse of Maple Leaf Gardens. Remember those days when no one knew what to do with the old Maple Leaf Gardens? Do you remember those debates? Remember how long that went on for? Like, it went on for a long time, and it was really stressful because there was a lot of talk of just tearing it down. There really was. This is a very interesting example. And remember, when you go on for a long time and you can't quite find the use to adapt a building, the building continues to become more and more vulnerable. It becomes more and more vulnerable because we start to feel our creativity might fail us. We start to think, you know what, you can't do anything with this building. Forget it. It should just be torn down and let's put up a condo. We know there's a market for condos right here. Well, in fact, this is a great example of tenacity. Holding on, a lot of players coming together, including Ryerson University stepping up to the table and identifying a series of ways that they could use the building for university uses, and then Loblaws really stepping out of the box and embracing a lot of complexity to build a truly unique supermarket that I would venture to say is also an important community space and gathering space. And for anyone who hasn't been there, right in the heart and the center of the Loblaws, there's tables and chairs like you're sitting in a cafe, which is a wonderful way to draw the community into this space. It's unconventional. Who goes and sits down and has a coffee in the middle of a supermarket? Well, when that supermarket is a very important public space, a building that people associate their memories with, then the operator, supermarket, starts to think out of the box as to how to use that space in new ways and to push the boundaries of their own model. So I would in fact argue that precisely because of the history and legacy of this building, Loblaws was pushed to think about how they could re-envision a supermarket. Maple Leaf Gardens gave us that. It gave us a very different model for supermarkets that is about community gathering. And that's something that is a real gift that heritage buildings give us. They force us to think about new existing uses in very different ways, precisely because of some of the complexities that they present. So I'd like to just shift gears here and talk a little bit about heritage conservation districts. Because I've talked about individual projects, tall buildings and adaptive buildings. Now I'd like to talk about on the district scale, on the neighborhood planning scale. And it's important to know that we've struggled in the City of Toronto with not quite having the heritage resources that we require in order to protect all the buildings that we would like to protect. So embracing heritage conservation districts is an intentional, concerted strategy to say, how can we protect as much heritage infrastructure as possible and leverage our efforts in order to ensure that we're protecting the history and the legacies that exist within this city. So we've identified as a planning priority a strategy for the creation of HCDs. We did this by creating a template and creating a roster for consultants so that we could be unfolding a whole series of heritage conservation districts at the same time. We have 16 nominated HCDs that are being reviewed for prioritization. We have 3 HCD studies that are being added this year. We have 7 HCD plans that are underway as of last year, that we initiated last year. So we have a tremendous amount of effort that's going in right now to creating district studies to be protecting heritage on the district scale. And you can see here in this slide that there's a variety of different places that they're taking place in the city. Most of them are in the downtown. Of course, it's the oldest part of the city, but it's also where the growth is. And we have so many areas that have been nominated in the city to be heritage conservation districts. We created criteria to evaluate where we should begin. How do we decide which ones we do first? And one of those criteria is in the high growth area. So where the heritage resources are the most threatened, we want to do those districts first. Because of course we know that we have areas of the city that are changing so rapidly that we're not getting a chance to even protect the heritage resources, and they're already gone. And that's a real challenge. So a key prioritization criteria has in fact been ensuring that we are getting them built in high growth areas. This means that we have studies currently underway on Yonge Street, in the King Spadina Warehouse District, in the Garden District, in Queen Street East, Riverside, in the St. Lawrence neighborhood. That one's about 25 years overdue. And we're also soon starting heritage conservation districts in Kensington Market, the Distillery District, and Queen Street West from Bathurst to Roncesvalles. These are huge swaths of the city that in several years' time will be protected. The heritage assets will be protected. And as they change and grow and evolve, they will be required to change and grow and evolve in keeping with the heritage priorities and values that have been identified. So we believe that we now have a very strong process, and we just need to keep driving forward the implementation of these districts. And this gives you an example, if you can, I don't know if you can even see that there, of some of the draft policy that's coming forward, particularly related to protecting the street walls on our main streets. And this is something that is of particular concern and something that we struggle with. We have policies to redevelop our avenues into mid-rise buildings, 8-story buildings. Unlike the tall building guidelines that I showed you, where we can secure and protect the heritage Main Street and we push the taller building in, on our avenues, we bring the new development right out to the edge of the street and the existing fabric disappears. We are very concerned with ensuring that we're not losing heritage main streets, because heritage main streets are a very important part of livability, walkability, and neighborhood character. And this is a tension that we continue to see in the city. And if I could wave a magic wand and identify all the heritage main streets that ought to be protected, I would do so. The Heritage Conservation District approach is our approach to trying to do so as quickly as possible. We also identify in the context of our HCD's different heritage character areas. And so, for example, in the King Spadina HCD plan draft guidelines, we've identified a series of different character areas, and there are, in those micro character areas, there are specific policies with different direction around greater or lesser intensification. So in some areas, we're going to allow more intensification, and in other areas, we're going to allow less. We are very conscious of being nuanced in how we approach these heritage conservation district areas. A little bit about our 10-year plan. Our goal is to deliver 45 heritage conservation district plans by 2023, including revising the 15 out-of-date HCD plans and creating 30 new ones. And we're aggressively moving forward towards that goal. We're also very conscious of addressing the unequal distribution of HCDs across the city, because most of them are currently in the downtown core. And we recognize the importance of talking about and promoting HCDs as a very important growth management tool in a high growth context. A big way that we've been seeking to do this is by building up our staff resources and building up our processes so that we can execute our heritage conservation districts in an effective and strategic manner. I'd just like to close by talking a little bit about what I'll call the future of the past. One of the challenges that we see has to do with our Heritage Register forecasting. We know that we are adding, as a result of our HCDs, significant assets, heritage assets, that need to be managed over time. And one of the risks that we have is that we protect heritage infrastructure, but we don't have the bodies in place to, in fact, be implementing those policies, issuing the permits, ensuring that when redevelopment takes place, that it is responsive to the policy protections that we've put in place. This is a great risk. And about a year ago, I did some analysis of Montreal, Chicago, New York to basically say, you know, given the heritage buildings that they have on their register, how many staff do they have? And of course, what I discovered is that what we have in the Toronto is woefully inadequate. And this does put us in a very reactionary kind of position. So my advice would be to anyone who has jurisdiction in this room, if you really care about heritage, you must ensure that you have the heritage staff that can implement the policies that you approve. And I guarantee that if your policies are not being implemented, it's probably because you don't have people in place who can implement those policies. I've never met someone in Heritage Preservation Services who isn't extremely passionate about heritage preservation, and I know that my team is exceedingly, exceedingly overworked. I'd also just like to mention that as part of our official plan review process, we recently brought forward policies, OPA 199. I won't get into these in great detail, but they were just approved at the OMB after a mediated settlement. The Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals gave our OPA 199 the National Award for Excellence for Heritage Policy. We're very proud of this. These policies were negotiated extensively with a broad array of stakeholders, and now we're moving forward to ensure that they're implemented as our city continues to grow and change. I'll just like to end with what I'll call strategies for success, and most of these I've touched on already in my comments. The first is, it's really critical to ensure that you have the staff resources, so the processes in place, and also the staff in place to implement your vision for heritage preservation in your city. It's also critical to ensure that you have a strong policy framework. That's why we put so much effort and time into OPA 199. Because we have the weight of policy. Some of those negotiations that I told you about with tall buildings, they weren't negotiated at council. We took our policies to the developer, and we open up the policies, and we say, look, this is council-approved policy. So it doesn't even have to become political. We can use strong policy in those negotiations. So ensure you have strong policy that you can use to implement the will of council with respect to your heritage vision. It's also critical to develop a short, mid, and long-term strategy for the city. Heritage conservation districts is part of a long-term strategy. The short-term strategy was to put a template in place to expedite the creation of heritage conservation district. It's also really important, and we're struggling with this because we just haven't had time to do it yet, but to create a clear communications plan with key messages. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around heritage. We need to continue to build an understanding around the importance of our heritage assets to the long-term economic viability of our cities, to the long-term livability of our cities, to creating meaning and identity in our cities, so that our cities have a connection to the stories that make them unique. We need to figure out better ways to be communicating that. We also need to ensure that we align conservation goals with other city planning studies. The fact that Heritage Preservation Services is integrated in city planning results in a lot of negotiation, but it's good. Our urban design policies around the design of the streetscape are very much informed by the thinking of our Heritage Preservation Services staff and what they've taught us about street walls and datum lines. This is a very important point, that heritage preservation isn't something that happens in one little unit. It needs to be something that's a part of the overall culture in the city. And lastly, ensure heritage incentive programs are robust. We've in fact just gone through a review. We realized that our heritage incentive programs were not working very well We weren't getting the outcomes we desired. We weren't sure what the outcomes were because we weren't measuring them properly. We've now revamped the entire program. We've added additional incentives, and we're measuring the outcomes of those incentives. The robustness of those programs is going to be a critical way that you can measure the private sector investment that's going into heritage, investment in the city, and whether the incentives you provide are generating the kind of leverage that is in the city's long-term interest. Thank you very much.